Excellent. And please feel free to contribute.
I think this is called the Raymond and Nicholas territory.
No, this is also your game. Feel free to jump in, please.
Certainly. Excellent. So Raymond, just as a point of departure, the topic of the webinar is, so what now? When and if the lockdown doesn't get extended and we are allowed to return to work, let's say the statistics that we've got in terms of the national infection rate are correct, and that we are plateauing, and that by the 16th of April, we may be able to return to work. What then? Is there anything you want to add from a employment law perspective?
Yeah, look, I'll happily speak to that. I must say that I think it's far too early for us to make any of those assumptions, as I'm sure you. And really what we're focusing on here is when the lockdown does end, whenever that may be, what are the approaches that employers must adopt? What are our responsibilities?
Sure.
Not only towards our employees, which is important, towards anybody with whom our employees interact and anybody who comes into our workplace.
Yeah. So I think maybe just a point of departure for us is just to get everybody on a common ground with regards to how this virus can infect your body. So, and this is something that, I mean, maybe before we get in there, Ray, as I said to you earlier, before we started the video off, I had to go out shopping for my family this morning, so I went out on my own. I'm also fortunate enough to have access to the correct rated respirators for the type of risk that I was going into, and I went to Checkers and I went to Woolworths this morning. And I have to say that I was absolutely horrified by the fact that there were probably between 2 and 5% of people that were in those two shops that were wearing either gloves or a respirator of any form. So that was a person who had a homemade bandana that they had tied around their face, or was wearing gloves. And I think what appalled me the most was that all of the staff within Woolworths and Checkers in the area that I went to, not one of them had any form of protection on them, other than people sanitizing their hands when they came through the door. What was surprising is that the shopping centers that I've been to, is that the cleaning staff and the security staff all had masks and had gloves. So those type of essential services are being provided with a modicum of controls or protection for them to look at. But just either there's a general apathy out there. I also appreciate the fact that there is a constrained access to masks. And as I mentioned to you, we're bringing in a whole load next week. Anyway, I mean, have you been out of the house yet, Raymond?
I have. I've done 2 little forays to the spa to get fresh goods.
Yeah. And
our local spa has taken fantastic measures. Their plastic screens to screen the tellers from flying spit, and they're wearing masks. They were wiping down the surfaces between every customer being processed, and the security guards had masks. There was a high level of integrity from the employer's perspective, which was actually very impressive. The shoppers ranged from several people wearing what looked like N95 masks or similar to nothing.
Yeah. And what would you say was the percentage of people within the stores that were wearing any form of protection?
Less than 10%.
Less than 10%. Sure. All right. So to anybody who's joined in on the webinar, just from a perspective, maybe even by means of introduction. So my name is Nicholas Graham. I own a company called Safety Risk Management. We are safety, health, environmental, quality risk specialists. I've been in the game for over 25 years. I'm a lecturer for Northwest University, and my particular area of expertise is integrated management systems, so integrated business risk management systems. And some of the point of this discussion is myself and Raymond wanted to engage with people on a conversation and say, well, what are your business's plans if and when we start back up again? Because there's a regime of legislation which is going to apply to businesses, and if, based on what I'm seeing currently within the shopping centers and people going around, I don't think people have the foggiest idea of what it is that they need to do from an employee perspective. So Raymond, please feel free to jump in at any particular stage.
Well, perhaps I can ask you a question. Much of the information prior to the lockdown and in the early phases of the lockdown was that the use of masks was really not a preventative measure. In other words, it wasn't intended as a prophylaxis to avoid people from receiving the virus in the form of airborne spray or however it's transmitted, but rather to prevent sick people from transmitting it on to people who are not sick.
Yeah.
If that's the case, and bearing in mind that there's a long period during which those who have the virus are asymptomatic, what responsibility is there on members of the public to be wearing masks or other protective measures?
I think, unfortunately, that assumption flies in the face of how the virus is transmitted. So funnily enough, we put out a video last week in which I chatted to people on what the man in the street can do, because not the average Joe man in the street is not going to have access to an FFP2 or an N95 mask, etc. So what is it that they can do? If I'm talking to you and I'm within 6 feet range of you, as I'm talking, droplets of saliva, etc., could be expelled from my mouth, or worst case scenario, I sneeze. So now there are small droplets of water that are within the air. If you inhale those, if they come into contact with your eyes, that droplet of saliva comes into contact with your eyes. If you inhale it through your nose or through your mouth, that is a way that COVID-19 could get into your body. So that's a generally accepted route of intake for what we're classifying as a hazardous biological agent. So that's a very practical way that it can get in. So the video that we put together last week just said, hey, if you're going, I'm fortunate enough that I wear glasses. And if I'm going out to the shop, I wear glasses and I wear a respirator. And I have to say, I think the two ideologies work quite well together, because I wear a mask for myself, and so that I'm not going to inhale possibly COVID-infected water droplets that have come from somebody else's respiration, etc. And also, worst case scenario, say I am infected, but I'm unaware of it, I'm then protecting the other people. However, what we need to take cognizance of is that, now here was fatal error number one, is I've been in the shops for, and obviously my clothing, I've been in the shops for the better part of an hour or so. I came out, and now being on the inside of a respirator, you're quite sweaty. It's hot on the inside of the respirator. And as I've sanitized and I've now got into the car, I took my respirator off. And because I was sweaty, the first thing I wanted to do was to try and wipe the sweat off my face. And there I would have basically taken unprotected areas of my clothing and then wiped it against my face. Now, I'm a proponent of respirators and gloves. The concern that I have is people still touching their face, or finding some area that's been into contact with items within the stores or rubbed against other people that you're then putting in contact with your face. And you then obviously undo all the good work that you've done within there. So we need to practice outstanding levels of hygiene within this next time, and be very cognizant of all the things that we're touching. Does that answer your question, right?
It does, thank you, and that's very helpful. I'm a total germaphobe, so this has been quite easy for me in many respects. What are we telling our employer clients?
Okay. Now that's,
as far as the let's say, for argument's sake, everybody comes back to work on the 17th of April, as matters presently stand. Everybody gets into public transport or their own private vehicles. They arrive at the doorstep of the employer, and what? What
now? Outstanding, great question. Yeah. So I think let's first deal, with the virus in itself. So, and then the legislation. So what's incumbent upon the employers, they have to perform a risk assessment. Now, this should have been done please note, employers, well in advance of your employees returning to work. You're going to have an understanding of what this virus is and what are the potential exposure areas within your business. And even down to the fact that you should look at classifying the risk exposure levels of your employees and then applying appropriate controls within those risk exposure levels. So if you've got a person, let's say Checkers, Woolworths, Spar, any of those people who are dealing with members of the public, they're within the 6 feet range, you're going to have to take appropriate steps. Now, I mean, what is catnip to health and safety people is the fact that we always talk about what's called a hierarchy of controls. So whenever we've got a hazard or a risk, we know that we've got to attack this thing through the hierarchy of controls. So to any employer, you're going to have an understanding of how this virus can affect your people. One, it's going to be either by virtue of respiration, people coming into contact with one another and breathing in water droplets that might be COVID infected, or coming into contact with surfaces that have been touched by people that are infected with the COVID virus. So you have to have a comprehensive understanding of the nature of the hazardous biological agent and how it's going to come into contact with your staff. So the kind of the triggers or the key legislation is going to be the Occupational Health and Safety Act, Sections 8, which is the duties of the employer, Section 13, duty to inform, Section 14, duties of the employees, also looking at Section 37 of the Act. You're going to have a look at hazardous biological agents. Now, I had a very interesting discussion with another attorney online a couple of days ago with regards to the hazardous biological agents, because I quizzed him and I said, well, how are the hazardous biological agents triggered by COVID? And if you have a look at the HBAR regulations, it's either where a person an organization is working with a hazardous biological agent because that is what they do, or it's by virtue, so they are, I'm just looking for the particular term that they use in the regulation, they're working with it as a natural process of what they do, or there's been an incident, which is now where this is going to open up the hazardous biological agents regulations to so many other employers, is where there has been an incident involving a hazardous biological agent. And obviously this is the whole nature of this discussion. So now, once an organization has looked at that, our first port of call when we have a look at the hierarchy of controls for any hazardous biological agent is to try and eliminate it. Now, the elimination component is quite difficult within this. Now, we're trying our very, very best to eliminate COVID-19 infection, either by virtue of isolation, which is obviously one of the controls, is that people working from home, but it's not in the strictest sense a form of elimination, is segregation or rotating workforce. So elimination of it would probably come into play when we do have immunization, but that seems to be pie in the sky at the moment, or the duration seems to be so far away. So just some of the practical things that employers can look at is where you can, the employer needs to ensure that people can work from home, understanding that that opens up a different kettle of fish at home, because then a person's home environment then becomes their workplace. Now, is the employer then responsible for going and putting up chevrons and watch out signs around the home because this is now the work environment? So, I mean, that's going to open up a whole different conversation, which is a conversation for a whole nother webinar. So work from home where they can, rotating workforce as well, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to reduce the potential for exposure to COVID-19. So rotating workforce, restricting numbers of workers, particularly around, remember when we started the conversation, I said we need to classify workers into risk categories. So you want to make sure if you've got high risk workers in one area and low risk workers in another, but they all come back into the same canteen where they're going to have lunch, you failed. You need to be able to restrict those workers to particular areas where we can ensure that there are like cleaner areas or lower risk areas. So restricting, rotating workforce, workforce segregation of higher risk and lower risk employees. Then if we also have a look at engineering controls or any form of technology. Now, what was interesting to see coming out of China was them walking. I don't know if you saw trucks and people walking down the road with these massive chemical sprays, etc., that they were spraying all over areas to try and decontaminate. Another thing that I think shopping centers and areas are going to have to focus on, in particular, particularly employers, is going to be the rate of transfer of air within working environments. So installing highly efficient air filtration systems, increasing ventilation rates. So obviously the environmental regulations for workplaces speak about air rotation rates and breathable oxygen levels, etc. Employers are going to have to focus on the filtration of air and also increasing breathable air rates and the amount of breathable oxygen.
Can I pause you there for a moment? In a manufacturing environment, what you're talking about makes perfect sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Many people work in an office environment that has air conditioners.
Yes.
In varying states of repair. How does what you're speaking about now, filtration, ventilation, all of those things, affect a highly air-conditioned environment where many people would go and work?
Now again, it's really how long is this piece of string, because you've got air conditioners and you've got air conditioners. There's nanotechnology air conditioners now which have got really, really good antibacterial filtration systems built into them, versus somebody who's got not even a split unit, one of those old air conditioners that's built into the wall that's probably got a filtration system that came out when the Ark was first made. So unfortunately, it's going to depend on the level of filtration and the technology availability. One of the suggestions would be for employers, let's say you've got a call center. Let's look at a worst case scenario. You've got a call center of 1,000 people, and that is ducted air conditioning. Get your HVAC people in as soon as possible, preferably now during the lockdown period, to go and clean out the filtration systems, test to make sure that your airflow rates and your filtration systems are working effectively as part of your suite of controls that you're going to utilize, which I'm describing now. So that would be one of them. Get the guys in now, as they could be looked at as an essential service for making sure that your aircon systems are up and working effectively.
Brilliant.
So one of the things that I know as well, just in terms of those engineering controls, so one of my clients in Durban is busy manufacturing physical barriers, perspex barriers, that can be attached to the checkout counter, where the person who's managing the till can sit behind that perspex barrier. Now, you know, all good and well, I would take a respirator or a mask, a 3-ply surgical mask, over that type of a physical barrier, hands down, because unless you're going to physically enclose me in a perspex box as the checkout till person, but again, it is a practical barrier. It's a step in the right direction. So that's just something that I know. So drive-throughs and the McDonald's and all of those kind of guys. So some form of physical barriers, especially where employers have employees that are dealing with members of the public. We're going to have to look into some form of physical barrier between them, especially for that direct respiration of saliva and or whatever it is, person sneezing. So physical barriers are a good thing. Okay.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Okay, so sorry, carry on, Ray.
Yeah, continue. Please continue.
Now, I'm about to get into an administrative control, which is going to take a while. So if you've got a question, maybe now's the time.
No, I was simply going to make the statement that it's very helpful to outline those measures which can be done by employers now during the lockdown period.
Absolutely.
In anticipation of return. So you've spoken about ventilation and air systems. That's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
You've spoken about masks. What other measures should employers be considering now?
Okay, excellent. So this really brings me into the next one as well. It's around your internal protocol, your policies and procedures for hygiene and sanitizing various different areas. So one of the things that seem to be up in the air, there seems to be a lot of disparate information with regards to how long COVID survives on surfaces. So I think we would be reasonable to assume that we're all taking 21 days off work, okay? And if somebody was COVID infected and breathed or had some form of saliva all over their desk before they left work, one, I would say, can comfortably assume that by the time you get back to work, that work surface should be safe. Based on, I think the top time rating that I've heard currently, and I stand under correction, I'm not a scientist, was 4 to 5 days on a particular surface in terms of how long it could survive. And again, I'm open to correction on that based on any of the current information. Have you heard anything different, right? Okay. So getting the cleaning teams in, making sure, because you don't want your employees to be coming back to work and then you're sitting writing all of these processes out. You want to get your senior management team and your health and safety team for your business together, and you want to start writing these protocols now. So what are we going to do in terms of sanitizing? When people arrive at work, and we're busy importing a whole load of those infrared temperature guns, we've got 100 or so that are arriving in a week. So one of the things that we've suggested to a lot of our clients is get your security guards before somebody enters into your premises. Obviously, it's a non-contact thermometer. So you can see if somebody's got a temperature, and obviously then you can say, I'm sorry, you can't come in. And that's just a practical exercise in terms of eliminating somebody who is running a fever. It doesn't mean that infected people won't get into your workplace. Some of the symptoms may not have manifested yet. But so just to get back to the point, I would be sitting down with your risk management team within your business, and I would be writing those protocols now. I would be writing those risk assessments now if your organization hasn't done that already. And, you know, I say that tongue in cheek, because I don't think a lot of organizations have actually sat down and written really a correct understanding of COVID from a risk assessment perspective. Also, writing policies for what to do if you're sick. You know, if you're sick, what's the company process? Don't come to work. I mean, am I now going to require a letter? And people, this could be an interesting one from an HR perspective. It'd be good to get your insights there. If I think I'm COVID, am I now required to go and get a doctor? Most doctors don't want to see you if you're COVID infected. It's like it's directly off to the hospital. So am I required to get
There's also been a launch. There's also been a launch of telemedicine, telehealth, yes. More accurately, yes. Telemedicine. I see that the major cell companies have come on board and are offering that as a free service.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to see quite a lot of that, where employees are going to say, I've been in contact with a medical person over the phone. I've described my symptoms. They have said that I should remain off work for a certain period. And if my condition worsens, I'm to present myself to the hospital.
Yeah.
So I think that we're going to see more and more of that. So the traditional approach to medical certificates and the like, I think, is probably going to have to be relaxed.
Yeah.
I also think that there are going to be, and I'm speaking completely in the dark here, I imagine that there will be reference numbers and things.
Sure.
To avoid malingering.
Yeah. So I trust that everybody who's listening in is seeing the significant value in writing these processes now, because you're going to have had them written and approved, and where possible, communicated and distributed to people before they return to work, so that they're well aware of the company policies and procedures that are going to affect them before or when they come back to work. Yeah. So something you might have to induct everybody. Sorry, Karen, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. In terms of the legislation that you've referred to, Nick, and also the Disaster Management Act 2002, it requires a coordinated response, which includes the development of policies and protocols and strategies in accordance with existing legislation and any measures that are issued by the state to address the national disaster. And this is a national disaster. It's been proclaimed.
Absolutely.
So to the people out there in internet land, Nick can help you develop those policies and strategies.
Thanks, Ray. So one of the other things that I was thinking about is your emergency plans. You're going to need to review them. Remember that I mentioned, so your gate protocol can be using the infrared thermometer to scan people before they enter through the gate. So people that have got fevers are kept on the outside. But that doesn't mean that infectious people don't come in. Now, again, one of the areas that I'm driving very with a lot of weight with any of the clients that we work with is segregation of workforce. Now let's play this through.
Yeah.
Somebody gets through the gate. You're going to update your emergency plan to consider what happens if somebody who's now been in your workplace for a couple of days is now identified as being infected, which means they could be infectious as well. Now, having segregated your workforce into clusters of workers, it then is a lot easier for you to identify to who and how this could have been transmitted. So that segregation of workforce into high and low risk categories, I think, is essential for any business to consider. And then that will allow your emergency plan to then kick in to say, right, this person's now been identified as being sick. They came into contact with that person, and that person, rather than if they weren't working in clusters, this person's now been around your entire business. Okay. So other practical things, your housekeeping protocol, as simple as that's in. I am an avid supporter of good housekeeping. And the reason that I support that is if you can't get the essentials right, then you're not going to get the big things right. So make sure that your workplace is neat and tidy and any unessential things are packed away, etc. Especially the stuff that you're going to be touching regularly, that you're not allowing other people to touch.
Can I just make a comment?
Please
guys,
do.
If you don't mind. It's Brad speaking here. You're talking a lot about the workplace hygiene, and I think there's a piece that you may want to consider giving advice as you go forward, and that is around contact tracing.
Yeah.
Because what happens when you have a person who has symptoms? Well, a person has symptoms. They're not sure whether they do or don't have symptoms related to a COVID infection. So they call in using telemedicine, or they go in and they get tested and they found that they are positive for the virus. There's a couple of protocols that need to be included because this is a category 1 notifiable disease. The National Institute needs to be notified, NICD.
Yeah.
The minute they do, the company has to be part of a process of contact tracing, which means everyone that person has been in contact with. Let's say I work for you and I notify you that I'm COVID-19 positive, and I work with 15 people. You have an obligation as an employer under Section 8 of the OSH Act and under the Disaster Management Act, and notably under the regulation that was passed yesterday, which is the amendment to the regulations on the Disaster Management Act. It's actually Gazette number 658. And basically what it means is you need to assist in the collection of information and explain to your employees that this is not unreasonable disclosure of their information. You then have to capture, in cooperation with the NICD, all of the names and the contact details, including ID numbers and telephone numbers of these people. And they're obligated to comply. So when you start talking about your workplace hygiene policy and your return to work policy and your sick at work policy, I think it would be very useful to include the contact tracing requirements.
Absolutely. Great point.
Very helpful.
Thanks, Brad. Cool. So just continuing on from there, obviously focusing on your housekeeping, and then essentially once you've got people back to work, and these protocols must be written long in advance, what are the hygiene practices of your business? And then going through your business and having a look at high traffic areas, making sure that you are increasing your cleaning requirements, your cleaning protocol, bathrooms, canteens. My personal suggestion would be to not have them open if at all possible, where people are congregating and eating together, etc. To focus on the two key areas, there's increasing your hygiene protocol within the business and your cleaning company, liaising with your cleaning company, and also focusing on the chemicals that they're utilizing to be able to clean. Are they sufficient? And then also making sure that you are creating suitable communication around personal hygiene. There's been some amazing videos, and I really liked a video that came out on YouTube about a week or so ago where a person had a pair of blue gloves on and they put some black ink on them. And basically they rubbed their hands and tried to clean their hands. And it took them literally 20 seconds from getting the ink onto their hands until they'd actually covered those blue gloves with black ink. and it showed suitably how small areas of your hands can remain exposed or uncleaned if not cleaned properly. And there's a good way of assessing the fact that you've cleaned your hands suitably for 20 seconds if you're able to sing happy birthday to yourself twice. And you have the joy of then singing happy birthday to yourself twice, numerous times a day as you're cleaning your hands. Also, people are going to have to consider all of their current safe work practices within the business, particularly if you're dealing with members of the public. All of your protocol are going to have to be updated. And remember, just in terms of Section 37 of the Act, and also particularly Section 13 of the Act, where you have a duty to inform. So you've identified all these COVID risks, you've updated all your protocol, you've updated your safe working procedures. You now have a duty to inform all of your employees of that updated information. And Section 13 goes a step further, where you don't just have to inform, but Section 10, and I really, really like that particular caveat of legislation, because it says it's incumbent upon the employer to ensure that the employee has understood or is conversant to the particular terms that they use, is conversant with the hazards, risk, and means of protection. So the term conversant there means, and I really enjoy that, because a lot of people, they'll do induction, they'll tell everybody about something, they sign an attendance register, and then they stand up and leave the room. If the guys just sign an attendance register, that's evidence of the fact that the person was in the room. It's not evidence of the fact that they understood anything. So it would be incumbent upon the employer to inform people, but then also ask them questions or test them where possible, where literacy levels allow, so that you can confirm that the person has understood exactly what it is that you've told them. Okay, so moving on to some of the personal protective equipment. Now, I do a lot of legal audits for large organizations, and probably kind of my go-to question when I'm asking people about personal protective equipment within their organization is, have you trained your employees in the care, use, and limitation of the personal protective equipment that you've given to them? And 9 times out of 10, the person doesn't even know what I'm talking about. A lot of organizations will get personal protective equipment, and they will then say to the employee, there it is. And they will assume that they know how to look after it, how to care for it, how to use it effectively, and then most importantly, the limitations of the personal protective equipment. So it's incumbent upon any employer, once they have provided personal protective equipment, to train the employee in the care, use, and limitation. And a good example of that is let's say a pair of earplugs. The standard noise reduction rating on a set of earplugs can be anything between 22 and 25 decibels. So when you give that to an employee, you should be saying, hey, if you're using a jackhammer, which can be up to 120 decibels, and you then put these in, it's only going to take 22 to 25 decibels off that total rating. So you're still effectively standing in a noise zone if you've got earplugs in. And regularly I'll be driving past construction sites and the guys are jackhammering away and they've just got a pair of earplugs in. And because they don't understand the limitation of the personal protective equipment, they're exposed to a dose. So let's have a look at the type of PPE that you should be issuing to your employees. So at the top, for the highest risk employees, either a face shield. Now we're looking at a person, let's say a surgeon who's dealing with COVID infection. You should have a face mask, and then you should have an N95 respirator on. Now the N95s are very rare. Again, we're bringing in a shipment of them in a week or so's time. They have the top rating for a non-filtered, as in non-cartridge related respirator. And those are the ones that medical people. Now, what we've suggested in our note that we sent out to people, the N95 respirators, there are not a lot of them. So I don't think the average man in the street should be wearing an N95. If you've got one, great. But we should be keeping those aside for the people that are at highest risk. Now, the N95 respirators should be for medical staff. They should be for the elderly, the infirm, the immune compromised, or people who are asthmatic. So if you do have stock of N95 respirators, please ensure that you are keeping them for the people who are the most vulnerable in terms of this particular disease. So
just to be clear, Nick, when you're referring to the N95, that's a face mask, right?
It is a face mask, so it fits over your nose and your mouth. And that an N95 is a particular rating that's given to a respirator in terms of the level of protection and also its construction to be able to get that rating. Now, I've personally, just over the past couple of days, been using what's called an FFP2 rated respirator. Now, for me, going out to the shops, an FFP2 rated respirator would still be suitable. Now, that most factories as such, if you've got guys who are working with any forms of dust, etc., many of them should have FFP2 rated respirators lying around. I don't think an FFP1 respirator would really cut the mustard as far as I'm concerned. It's better than nothing at the end of the day, but I would be looking at an FFP2 respirator or an N95 respirator. Also, then having a look at gloves. Now, just Raymond, I wanted to jump back to the value of masks, which was a question that we asked at the beginning. I believe that masks are, I mean, personal protective equipment is always the last layer of control. However, in this case, in my mind, it can protect you from inhaling water droplets that somebody else has respired. It can then protect you if you're infectious from infecting somebody else. But one of the things that I really like about face masks as well is it stops you from touching your nose and your mouth, particularly when you're out in there. So I'm an avid fan of them. There was another little article that came out the other day just in terms of the effectiveness of all these respirators versus a bandana versus, please, members of the public, if you're out there, don't use anything that is a layer of fabric and a sponge. That is, I think, 0.1% effective in terms of what we're trying to achieve. So respirators and then also gloves. But then most importantly, and with gloves, if you're touching surfaces, you've got to be very aware of what you're touching after that. So, and one of the other things that we did, and if anybody's looking for it, we did a YouTube video on, if you are wearing gloves, how to get them off. Because there's nothing worse than a person who takes off their gloves and then takes what is now a clean hand and manhandles the dirty hand to get them off. There's a special way to take gloves off where you pinch them at the top with both gloves on, you pinch them, you pull this glove off, you roll it up into this hand, and then you obviously put your fingers under the other glove and pull it off with that first glove in it. And then it goes into the bin because it could be classified as hazardous waste. So I might look, sorry, carry on, Ray.
Yeah, I saw a photograph today of a guy standing in a grocery store wearing gloves and eating chips with them.
Sorry, I shouldn't be laughing, but yeah. Was that the Darwin Awards?
Yeah, not far off.
Okay. So gloves, and then also, I mean, I'm fortunate that I wear glasses, so I might look like I'm the most risk-averse person, but who knows, maybe being a little bit more informed than the average member of the public. I'm going out, I've got my glasses on because I don't want to get anything into my eyes. I've got my FFP2 and soon to be an N95 mask on, my gloves and my glasses. And then obviously I practice good hygiene and sanitizing after that. And something that I actually asked the owner of the One Checkers this morning whether they were supplying masks or whatever to their employees, and they said no, that they had face shields on order. So I think we're going to have some very comical pictures come the end of this particular pandemic, just in terms of what people were walking around the shops with. So maybe just in passing, Raymond, I can't emphasize to anybody the importance of doing a comprehensive risk assessment. It's a legal requirement. Occupational Health and Safety Act Section 8 requires the employer to identify anything, all the hazards and risks to safety and to health. And I think that's the danger of our particular profession, is that many people are safety specialists. There are very, very few people within our profession who have got a comprehensive understanding of health-based risk factors. So, and I think it would be a very prudent approach from any employer to identify, categorize their employees into very high, medium, and low risk. And I have to say, I even hate the term low risk. I prefer the ISO 31000 criteria that they use in terms of ALARP and maintain, because I think low risk is very often achieved through suitable and maintained controls, rather than it brings across a fake assumption that you're at low risk, but only if you utilize your controls effectively. So anyway, Ray, that's just my thoughts on some of the things that employers could do, and particularly now during the shutdown, and start preparing your thoughts and your risk assessments and your protocol, and getting your ventilation systems maintained, and getting all your policies, procedures up to date and approved and finalized and communicated. And where possible, do online training with your people where you've got the ability to do it. Do it online with people before they return to work. because otherwise you're going to have a whole lot of uninformed people who are coming into the workplace, and they could have had some form of exposure on the way to work, during transport, whatever. Make YouTube clips, make short clips, get them out to people over WhatsApp. Start getting your communication and your training out to employees now. I mean, it's the beauty of technology.
But make sure that they're right.
Yes, yes. Again.
Because unfortunately, one of the key features that we've seen repeatedly throughout this pandemic is the spread of misinformation.
Absolutely.
So really make sure that it's correct.
Yeah. Is there anything you'd like to add in there, Ray?
Yes, one of the protocols that needs to be developed and considered, and it's going to be specific to the workplace, and it's going to be specific to the different risk level of the various employees in the organization, is how the employer is going to conduct surveillance, by which I mean medical testing. And
Sure.
Medical testing can be both invasive or non-invasive. It can be questions. It can be a thermometer. There's a range. Because as soon as there's a general rule against any form of surveillance, any form of medical testing, there are exceptions to that rule, and those exceptions are fairly specific, and they relate to the inherent requirement of the position, health and safety in the workplace, and public policy. So there's a whole range of things. It's too particular for me to deal with any degree of particularity now.
Sure.
But just bear in mind that the function of an employer is not to test employees whether they have COVID-19 or not. That's the function of medical people.
Sure.
The employer has an obligation to provide a safe working environment, and that includes conducting proper risk assessments, which is what Nick's been talking about, in relation to people who are entering the premises. And it's not, so for example, you can test temperature, but at the moment an employer starts conducting genuine medical surveillance and testing for COVID-19, when obviously limitations of what you can do, there's a process to that. Because it is a notifiable disease, if somebody is found to be COVID positive in your work environment, the entire place gets shut down.
Yeah.
And that may be appropriate. So there really are consequences, and it has to be very carefully thought out. It has to be there has to be good information. There has to be expert advice on this, and it has to be conducted in consultation with medical and other appropriate health experts. Because a mistake here could be not only costly in terms of lives, because it could,
Yeah.
but also it could have catastrophic consequences for the business. It really has to be done properly and well.
No, very true. You know, myself and my wife were discussing yesterday evening some of the social impacts of this, and I wonder if it's going to be an end to handshakes as we know it.
Yeah.
Which was originally the intention behind the handshake, was to shake somebody's hand to reveal that you weren't carrying a weapon. But now the handshake could be the fact that you are. Absolutely. Absolutely. So I think there's going to be some very, very far-reaching, aside from the economic and social impacts of all of this. But yeah, Ray, thanks again for your time. Is there anything else you'd like to add in there? It's always a pleasure chatting with you. Thanks very much. And Brad, thank you very much for your valuable contribution. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Raymond. Thanks, everyone.
Excellent.
Cheers, guys.
Okay then. Cheers.